as you see a 12/31/2027 cliff date for projects that aren't safe harbored through this start of construction, what if something happens in your build cycle? What if you have an issue with the roof? What if you have a safety incident? What if you dig up something that you didn't expect you'd find in the ground? Like all these things that could take not just like a week or two off the timeline, but like may pause everything for 6 months. And that's really scary.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Renewable Rides. In this episode, we're bringing you a recording from a recent webinar where we unpack the new solar and storage ITC requirements and why so many teams are pulling 6 years of projects into the next 2. You'll hear from Marc Palmer, founder and CEO of Conductor Solar, a platform that specializes in matching qualified investors with experienced developers, EPCs, and getting deals across commercial, industrial, and community solar done. He's joined by Dan Roberts, who you are all very familiar with by now, and is an expert in this space. Together, they dig into safe harbor strategies to navigate FIAC, or Foreign Entity of Concern challenges, the risks of the 2027 place in service cliff, and why now, not later, is the moment to act. If you're planning solar or storage projects in the next few years, this one's packed with practical guidance. So let's dig in.
It's been a wild, approaching 3 months now since the passing of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or your favorite term. There's plenty floating around there. But I think really that we've had an opportunity to see how the market's reacted, how the dust has settled. We've gotten some additional guidance coming from the executive order that was issued a few days after the passing of the act, and so we're gonna touch on a couple of those items as we get started here, and then really dig into a conversation between Marc and I. As far as introductions, for those of you that don't know me, I'm one of the co-founders here at VECKTA, really leading go-to-market, so all things sales, marketing, partnerships. Myself and Gareth Evans, our CEO and co-founder, also co-host Renewable Rides, a podcast where we hit on people's journey in the space. And I've spent my whole career in high-growth software companies across energy, healthcare, software, and digital identity. And I'll pass it to Marc for a quick introduction as well.
Yeah, hey everybody. Marc Palmer, the founder and CEO of Conductor. Conductor Solar is a software platform that connects buyers and sellers for DG projects, solar and storage primarily, and we focus on C&I and community solar projects. Largely, we're dealing with people who want to buy and sell projects at NTP. These are PPA deals for the C&I people on the call, and community solar deals in general. We also support a little bit with ITC transfers for customer-owned deals and some operating project sales. I just got back from a little backpacking trip and am a little under the weather. I think my body is a little angry at me for the last couple of days, but it was a lot of fun. So apologies if I'm a little hoarse or have a coughing fit, but I'm okay. I'm good. I'm ready to go, Dan.
You got the nature therapy. I'm jealous that you got that. Well, good. Well, let's dig in. I think for those that are on the call, we'll probably go somewhere on the order of 30 minutes. Although I'm sure we've got plenty of ground to cover, and if we keep rolling, then we'll keep going. So, quick recap. Really, when we look at the tax credit specific portions of the One Big Beautiful Bill, you're looking at from a timeline perspective or timing perspective, projects either must be placed into service by the end of 2027, so December 31st, 2027, to qualify for the investment tax credit, except for projects that begin construction, and we'll get into kind of the bifurcation of those definitions in a minute, but that begin construction by July 4th of next year, in which case those projects have 4 years to be placed in service, assuming they continue to make progress on those during that time frame. So you can buy yourself essentially a 4-year time frame. I think the interesting thing as it relates to C&I and related to most folks on these call is, unlike a 500 megawatt utility scale project that might take many years to build, if you begin construction by 4th of July next year, you're likely going to have the project done by the end of 27 anyways, but I think it is an important distinction, especially as EPCs and developers start to really get a backlog of projects, and then there's going to start to be some questions around where they prioritize. From a battery energy storage system perspective, the timelines actually remained unchanged from the Inflation Reduction Act, so these carry out all the way through the end of 2033. Although there is some nuances as it relates to the foreign entity of concern compliance, which, as it relates to solar and storage, any project that begins construction after January 1st of 2026 will be subject to following these rules. Although Marc will touch on a little bit of kind of the separation of the FIAC compliance and the ITC qualification here in a little bit. The other really interesting thing beyond the tax credits, but also tax sheltering related, is that you can now depreciate 100% of the project in year one. We were in a step down period. This year we were sitting at 40% and it was going to step down to 20%. And now we're back to an environment where we've got 100% bonus depreciation in year one. And for what the guidance was given, there's no foreseeable step down or phase out period. So until a different administration passes something else, we're in this new 100% bonus depreciation zone, which frankly, in the short term, assuming you can capture the tax credits and now get the bonus depreciation, short term, the business cases have improved, which I think is a really important bit. From a tax credit transferability perspective, we retain the ability to transfer tax credits. However, the buyers are now going to be subject to the FIAC requirements. And Marc, I'll give you an opportunity, or if you want to add anything here at a high level. Otherwise, we can save it for the discussion at the end.
Yeah, Dan, just one other thing that I think got updated from the budget bill was there was I think basically a drafting error on the domestic content threshold requirements that allowed basically a 40% threshold to be met for domestic content almost in perpetuity, I believe, at least at the time of the ITC. And the OB3 fixed that. And so it basically, as of I think the date of the OB3, it updated the domestic content requirement for the adder on the ITC to be 45% for 2025 projects and 50% for 2026 projects, and then increasing thereafter. So that was the other kind of cleanup thing that got a little hidden, but was meaningful in terms of the impact for anybody going after a domestic content adder.
Yeah, great addition. Now that does differ, and we'll jump into FIAC here in 2 slides, but does differ a little bit from the FIAC, like prohibited foreign entity compliance, right?
Yeah, related-ish, but different, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we'll get there in just a second. As far as the updates to start of construction or beginning of construction, this was what came from so on January 4th, the OBBB was passed on July 4th. On July 7th, there was an executive order that came down that was asking the Treasury to revisit how the date stamps on those projects are given. And so really what it looked at was going into effect. This came out, I think, on August 18th, and then it was going into effect starting projects that were happening on September 2nd or later. But projects that are larger than 1.5 megawatts AC require the use of the what quote unquote physical work test. And this is specifically related to solar. So in order to have your date stamp for beginning of construction, you have to start physical work. And really that means physical work of any nature on the project itself, or having a custom componentry that is dedicated to that project being built in a factory somewhere. And so like that's really the distinction there. For projects below 1.5 megawatts AC, they may still use the 5% safe harbor, meaning that they can incur 5% of the cost of the project and have that claim their point in time. I have linked off here to the actual language that came out from the IRS, but those are the 2 distinctions. Now this is going to be a little bit different than what we're about to touch on here in a second with the foreign entity of concern, prohibited foreign entity compliance. Marc, anything to add here?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, the anything that complies for start of construction for the greater than 1.5 megawatt AC project bucket also works for the smaller than 1.5 megawatt AC bucket.
Yeah.
It's just, it also can use the 5% spend test, which is, that's what the industry has relied on since whatever, 2012, 2013, like as PTCs and ITCs were temporarily phasing out and coming back in. And so just to make sure it's not either or, it's an and for the smaller projects. They also have that option, which many people use because it's just very straightforward to understand money that was spent beforehand. And just to be clear, there are some details that matter in terms of how you qualify for that 5% spend test. It's not like you can put down a refundable deposit and have that count. It has to be dollars that are going towards the project definitively. But it does give you some more flexibility for those smaller projects because you're able to buy equipment and ultimately put them into projects at a later date and time. And so anyways, we're getting into some of the nuances, but there's a million nuances here and they matter depending on the pathway people are choosing. And I know we've got people from all walks of life on this webinar. So we'll try to not go too deep on any of them, but give you kind of the teasers of what to look out for.
Yeah, and I'd also add similarly within the document that's linked off here, you also have a lot of call outs in the document of what does qualify for physical work. So things like, or what doesn't. So I remember reading through it saying that just getting permits does not, qualify as physical work, or surveying doesn't necessarily qualify as physical work. So there's
that one seemed to get a little stricter. I think, for a solar project, like largely it's, for a ground mount project, they want to see racking in the ground. Like that's kind of what I continue to hear institutional tax equity, kind of voicing their preference of what they will definitely be comfortable with and not necessarily, access road or clearing the site a little, like site prep work as much as something that is definitively for a solar project.
All right, now let's get into the hairy one. So as it came out, and with the One Big Beautiful Act, it talked about pretty extensively about this foreign entity of concern, and specifically within that, there's this PFE or prohibited foreign entity, and then it kind of adds another term there of material cost assistance ratio. But essentially what it's saying is that for projects that begin construction, and I'm using air quotes there because if we come back here, there's multiple definitions of what begin construction means. But for projects that begin construction in 2026, so January 1st and beyond, they're going to be subject to these material cost assistance ratios. And you'll see that they're slightly different for solar and for storage, but basically projects that begin construction in 26, so at least 40% of the equipment in the project needs to come from non-prohibited foreign entities, and those are company like physically coming out of, and the named countries are China, North Korea, Russia, and I believe Iran, but largely for this discussion it's China. So at least 40% or more of the equipment used in the project cannot be coming from China or from a Chinese-owned entity, or said differently, no more than 60% of the equipment in the project can be coming out of China. And then it's going to increase 5% each year. So for the next several years, meaning it is going to become more and more strict. Now, when we talk to a lot of the EPCs and developers in our marketplace, and I'm sure many of you on this call can chime in, that largely, especially as it related to the domestic content, they're following these types of guidelines. And it's actually even stricter because the domestic content has to come from on U.S. soil versus just not out of China. And so there doesn't seem to be a ton of concerns. I think as we start to see demand for these pieces of equipment, we may start to see some fluctuations in the price because there's going to be an increase in demand, and that'll start to come into the calculus of whether or not you use that to to capture the tax credits. Slightly different and maybe a bit more cumbersome on the storage side of things. So 55% in that case needs to be coming from non-Chinese entities, if you will. We've got a whole section here that we'll come on to in a second, where we can actually use the beginning of construction slightly differently as it relates to these foreign entities. But before we get into that, anything to add here, just on a kind of a high level about this?
Yeah, I think from a solar only perspective, I think largely like the industry discussion is it'll be surmountable, right? You'll be able to get comfortable with the solar projects qualifying from a FIAC perspective. The challenge is getting all the support you need to qualify that from a FIAC perspective for the ITC, such that institutional tax equity and the really conservative, tax investors will get comfortable with the project and investing in the project and not having any trip ups. So, when you think about the world, the tax equity investors, this is for these third-party owned projects, of which, it makes up a large part of the market, especially by dollar volume. They are the most conservative, you can be on this. They don't want to take risk as they invest from a tax perspective. And so they're really worried about having all the ticks and ties in terms of every single piece of the project complying with FIAC and having it documented and having it repped and warranted by the manufacturer. And fortunately, everybody's made some good progress on that with domestic content adders, because it's been the same requirements for qualifying projects for a domestic content adder. So I think the manufacturing, section of the solar industry and storage industry has been working to document these things and understand all the traceabilities. Now, the ownership levels of these different parts, like there's more angles that have come into play now than before. It's not just kind of where the material and the equipment comes from. But anyways, the industry has made some headway there. So I think it's really just getting comfortable with these manufacturing organizations, really putting weight behind the fact that they are compliant with FIAC. And I think that's where we still haven't seen them, kind of really take a stance that is, binding and it allows people to make investment at a very large scale. So I think that still has some ways to go on the solar side. I think on the storage side, it's an even bigger concern about, kind of meeting these thresholds. Everyone's talking about what they think is going to happen in 2026, but there's not a lot of definitive stances yet. So people are concerned, which, I think is why we can get to the next slide about how you can ensure your project doesn't have to worry about these provisions, because there is some uncertainty that still resides out there related to it.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into that. I mean, I think maybe let's keep running on this. So for everyone on the call, these were some of the kind of the key points that we figured we'd touch on for the remainder of the conversation. Maybe let's skip to the second one and talk a little bit about kind of the bifurcation of tax credits and FIAC compliance as it relates to beginning of construction.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about just big picture, the way the solar industry, fortunately, has largely moved from a policy perspective is once you start construction, you're safe harbored from a certain provision, coming into play later on. So that way you don't have to worry about, it's more of when you start the project and less when you end the project. Now, when you end does have some certain cliff dates, but fortunately you can start construction and not have to worry about, FIAC compliance. One of the nuances that Dan and I were chatting about before this call is in the OB3, you technically are, they wrote in the actual legislation that references back to prior guidance from, what start of construction means. And we talked earlier about how 5% spend threshold has always been kind of the one historic way that construction has been able to begin confidently. And the OB3 references that guidance for the FIAC compliance from a safe harbor perspective. So when you got this executive order in August that says, well, for ITC purposes, you actually have to do physical work for these larger than 1.5 megawatt AC projects, there hasn't been anything, at least to my knowledge, that ties that back to FIAC compliance. And so you think about before the end of this year from a FIAC perspective, I believe, and all the normal caveats, right? I'm not a tax attorney, like talk to your tax professional, et cetera. But my understanding is that you can spend 5% of the project cost before the end of 2025. And regardless of your project size, you can qualify to be safe harbored from FIAC. Now, you still would need to do things to qualify from an ITC perspective. So you have until the end of, beyond 2027 to put the project online and placed in service for ITC qualification purposes. But there are some gaps there between the two. And there may be projects and there may be, people on this webinar that's relevant for. So just noting that discrepancy that I think is out there, and I still haven't heard of anybody reconciling that, from a legal perspective.
Yeah. So basically, recapping there, let's say you have a 3 megawatt project, so well above the 1.5 megawatt threshold, and let's say you can 5% safe harbor, but before the end of the year, to avoid having to comply with any FIAC related regulations.
Yeah, so let's call that a $6 million project. You can spend $400,000 or, what would be 6.5% of the project cost before the end of this year to qualify it. So you don't have to comply with FIAC.
Yeah. But then from an ITC perspective, you would either begin physical work, but before 4th of July and buy yourself a 4-year window, and then you just have to have it placed into service within those 4 years, or begin physical work at some point there, after 4th of July and have it placed into service before December 31st, 2027.
Yep. Yeah. That's my understanding is, and then in that world, you wouldn't need to comply with FIAC.
Which I think is really important as we from a guidance perspective on buyers of these systems, whether it's I know we've got a couple folks on the call that are owner occupiers of their facilities, and they're looking at buying these projects outright from a CapEx perspective, or if you're a PPA owner. I think this is important because what's unclear is kind of how everything's going to fall out related to the guarantees that sit behind the FIAC compliance. And I don't know, Marc, from the conversations you've been having, where does that sit? Does that sit with the manufacturer, the OEM? Does that sit with the wholesaler? Where do we think who's going to hold the bag if it's not complying with FIAC?
Yeah, I mean, that goes to, everyone will say, we're good, right? We're good. I think the buck stops with the party that ultimately is manufacturing, the product, I think, is where it should stop. But now it's making sure that gets passed through appropriately to the wholesaler, and then the wholesaler passes it through to the installer, and the installer passes it through to the customer. So it should stop with, ultimately flow back to the person creating the equipment that's being purchased and installed, because they're the ones who are in control of this, and they're the ones who would ultimately cause a trip and a footfall if they didn't comply.
Yeah.
But I think that's a challenge, right? Is like, that's what's giving consternation, is that they aren't necessarily saying, you can come after us for, like, we're only a portion of your project, right? But you can come after us for the whole value of the ITC because we messed up. There's going to be friction here, no doubt about it.
And I think what it's going to present, and this is where some of the recommendations come in as far as what it's going to present. It's just going to present a lot more legal soft costs in the development of these projects, because the buyer's attorneys or the financier that owns the PPA, they're going to want to make sure that all that's buttoned up and they're feeling comfortable about it. And so it's just going to inject time and legal costs into reviewing those agreements and negotiating those agreements. And so all the more reason that if you are in a position to safe harbor these projects between now and the end of the year, might as well do it so you can avoid all that.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. It's right. Practically, it's probably not an issue for most projects, right? Whether or not it's an issue and whether or not you get audited and whether or not, you ultimately get the penalty flag thrown on you for not being compliant, I think the probability on all of that happening is low, but it's pretty catastrophic for somebody who invests with, a pretty substantial tax credit or direct payment, related to the project. And so, who wants to take on that risk? I think, I would expect more C&I customers to take on that risk than, long-term owner operators and IPPs, because they tend to look to banks and insurance companies and, huge corporates for tax appetites. I think you're going to see people who go into the transferability market. Ultimately, like most people who are buying tax credits from transferability are going to need those protections, because insurance, there's tax indemnity insurance that comes into play oftentimes, and the insurers who are involved in that, they want to make sure they're protected. And so a lot of the market will be impacted with, this FIAC compliance. And so not having to deal with it right now when the industry just doesn't really have a solution is definitely an attractive pathway if you're able to not deal with it, just you're right, the soft costs and things that go into it.
Yeah. I think it's worth maybe jumping up towards the top of, as far as how do you start? Because we're begin construction. I should rephrase that. How do you begin construction? And again, it comes back down to what's the size of your project outside of FIAC compliance, just generally for the ITC, whether or not you can safe harbor. If you're below the 1.5 megawatt AC threshold, you can safe harbor by incurring the costs and buy yourself that 4-year time frame. If you're a larger project, again, I think that's where there's a couple different pathways. Either you begin physical work, although you do need to get through permitting and interconnection before you can really begin physical work in earnest, unless it's componentry that's custom and dedicated to your project. But I think in C&I that's probably more rare than the big utility scale projects. Or you just need to make sure that you're placed in service by the end of 27. And I think what we're going to see, and we're already starting to see it, some of my colleagues that are more on the supply side of our marketplace, the EPCs especially, we're starting to see backlogs develop. And I think one thing that we're guiding our clients on is when you're getting into the contracting process, making sure that you don't get deprioritized. You've now moved forward with someone, and you don't want to get deprioritized and fall out of those timelines. And I could see an environment in which projects that have safe harbored and bought themselves for years, and projects that say begin physical work in September of 2026. So after that time frame, they've now got a window in which they've got to be placed in service by the end of 27, and those get prioritized. And now, from an ITC perspective, the buyer is safe because they've got that 4-year window, but they're still paying higher utility costs, and they're getting kind of bumped down the priority list. And what are some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody can speculate on what the market's going to do over the next year, but it's really hard to know with any sort of certainty. I mean, I think you can assume that utility rates will continue to go up, right? Whether or not it's year to year, but in the trend for sure, that's a pretty consistent thing. I think people get really scared when you have this cliff date when you have to be online by the end of 2027. And anything that goes wrong in the project. So we're seeing that a bit in California with the NEM2 deadline. So, that was a cliff date, and you had your reservation for the utility interconnection by a certain date, and then you have to be placed in service essentially. There's details, but whatever, by I think it's April 14th of 2026. And so that's a scary date where if you miss it, there's not any going back. And so as you see a 12/31/2027 cliff date for projects that aren't safe harbored through the start of construction, what if something happens in your build cycle? What if you have an issue with the roof? What if you have a safety incident? What if you dig up something that you didn't expect you'd find in the ground? Like all these things that could take not just like a week or two off the timeline, but like may pause everything for 6 months. And that's really scary when there's not you don't have any confidence that you'll get grace beyond that. So I think that smaller projects can absolutely start and finish within a year, and I'll do all the time, and like that should be fine. And there'll be plenty of projects that move forward on that pathway. But I think it's a little daunting if you're making an investment with a pretty big credit at the end. On the line.
Yeah, my line of late has just been to anybody. If you're thinking about doing any projects in the next 3 to 5 years, now's the time to really do it. Get moving in earnest and kind of claim your spot and get your date stamp as it relates to the ITC. And we're starting to see some customers who have they've got a bit of a deployment strategy between now and 2030 that are now saying, how can we pull as many of these projects forward that we were planning on, at least to buy ourselves the 4-year window?
I mean, listen, you've got right now, it's really hard to get anyone's attention. I mean, historically, I'd say the industry just runs lean, and there's, fewer people than there needs to be for most companies. And everybody's, works really hard, I think, in this industry. And I think that you're at a place where getting attention and kind of making sure you're one of the projects that get focused on is really important. We're, Dan, as I mentioned earlier, we're in the M&A activity of people buying and selling projects, which is a very common activity in this market. And it has been bonkers for the last 2 months. I mean, it was really slow during the whole reconciliation process, but it's just been nuts. And there's a lot of great quality projects. There's a lot of, suboptimal projects that are going back and forth. And then installers are going to get squeezed, and permitting is going to get accelerated, and people are going to, kind of move projects faster than they have in the past to the extent they can with this urgency. So I think the whole market's going to get really compressed over these next, especially the next 12 months. And even the year or two after that, I think there's just going to be a lot of scrambling to get things done, and people are going to try to pull, projects from the next 6 years into the next 2 to 3 years. And they're doing a lot of the next 2 to 3 years trying to get pulled in the next 6 months. And so it's just compounding. And I think, everyone's trying to get installers to get quotes for projects that aren't going to start till Q1 of 2027. And it's hard for them to do that. And they're going to start running out of bandwidth, and then projects are going to cancel. And anyways, it's just going to be kind of messy. So I think staying in front of it and staying on top of it is kind of necessary, but it's, there are going to be bumps for most projects and most parties here. So everyone should just take a deep breath. Bumps will come. It'll be okay. They always do. But anyways, just some thoughts of what the market might look like over the next couple of years.
Well, and I think that hits on our bottom point here of kind of will the increased demand, on labor and permitting slow down projects. But I think, like, intuitively, it seems like yes, because there's just going to be more constraints on the market. And I think hard to say from a permitting perspective. I think it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but from a labor perspective, I think it also, especially for folks that have many projects that they're looking to deploy, it's the opportunity to open up the aperture and have many potential options on projects, not just from a pricing and terms perspective, but from a timing and availability perspective. I think that it will become an increasingly important metric when determining which deployment partner to work with.
Yeah, I agree, Dan.
On the financing side, how are you anticipating, the PPA prices being impacted as we forge ahead, especially maybe in the near term, as we look at having to comply with FIAC, and then longer term as the ITC goes away?
Yeah, I mean, there's some balancing forces here. I think, what we've talked about generally just being everything getting pulled forward, just increased demand for for solar, increased demand for, on the labor side. I think that'll cause prices generally to go up. I think on the other side, people are going to they're scrambling and doing what they can to lock up projects and have things to work on over the next couple of years, right? And so that'll cause things to stay competitive, I think. And then there's some, fundamental market forces of what's going to happen to debt rates and, some of the underlying financing sources out there. I think on the whole, I'd expect prices to go up. Generally, I think you're going to see some, at least for the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see some, construction, solar installation costs go up generally. You're going to see the financing costs go up generally from like a PPA perspective, because I think they're busy working on a million things and they're going to choose to work on the ones that give them the best return. We're seeing that already. It's not consistent across the board, but there's fewer parties bidding at the same level they used to. There's like one that'll pop up here, another one that'll pop up here, and you don't necessarily know who it is. So I think on the whole, you're going to see PPA prices go up a bit. And because you got to pay for your spot, basically your reservation.
Excellent. Really appreciate everyone's time. Marc, thank you for your time. This was a good discussion, and probably one that we'll need to revisit in 2 or 3 months' time, because there's going to be a lot more learnings between now and the end of the year. But I think the key is just we spent a lot of time talking about the FIAC compliance, and I think that is the most clear on the timelines, but unclear on how everything's going to fall out. And so if you can, avoid it altogether and get your project safe harbored before the end of the year. Otherwise, we'll be here to support you in navigating complying with those regulations as we move into 26.
We'll hope that there's no major other changes that we need to dissect and go through in the next couple of months. But great being here. Fun to chat about all this, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. All right. Take care, Marc. Take care, everyone. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, everybody.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.